I kicked my adopted son out after he chose his bio dad. Now he's begging me to come back only because he wants this. Alright, so I, 39M, married my wife Linda, 39F, about 16 years ago. It feels like a whole lifetime has gone by since then. Anyway, when we got married, she already had a little boy, Mason, who was just 2 years old at the time. His biological dad was out of the picture. Like, no clue who he was, according to her. I didn't care about that, though. To me, Mason was my son from the moment we got together. I went all in with the father role, and after we got married, I officially adopted him. From that point on, I treated him like my own flesh and blood. He became the star in my world, if I'm being honest. I don't know how to explain it, but when you take on the role of being a dad, especially when you're adopting, you're not just taking on the good stuff, right? You're committing to all of it. The bad days, the tantrums, the sleepless nights, the school runs, everything. I was there for all of it. I wasn't just some guy who married his mom, I was his father. I made sure he knew that too. I always told him that while I wasn't his bio dad, I loved him just the same. We had a good relationship, and everything seemed solid, at least for a long time. Things started to change around the time Mason turned 15. It was subtle at first. He just seemed distant. You know how teenagers are, right? I figured it was one of those moody phases. Teenagers get cold, they push you away, and they act like you're just the most annoying person in the world for trying to talk to them. So I didn't think too much of it at first. It was nothing super dramatic. Just him not wanting to hang out as much, staying in his room all day, and getting into random arguments over the dumbest things. But that coldness grew. And honestly, it hurt. This kid who I'd raised for his whole life started to feel like a stranger to me. I thought maybe it was something I'd done. Maybe I was being too strict or something. I remember trying to talk to him a few times, like, "Hey, what's going on? You seem off lately." But I got the typical teenage response. "Nothing, I'm fine." So I backed off, thinking maybe he needed space. But it got worse. There was this one time I tried to plan a family day, just me and him, like old times, you know? We used to go fishing together when he was younger, and I figured that might bring us closer again. So I asked him, "Hey, want to go fishing this weekend?" He just looked at me and said, "Nah, I've got plans." That's when I realized something was seriously wrong. I asked him what his plans were, and he just shrugged me off, saying it didn't matter. He never used to talk to me like that. I didn't push him too hard, but my gut was telling me something was up. Then, one day I found out the truth, and man, did it hit me like a ton of bricks. Turns out my wife Linda had told Mason who his real dad was. Not only that, but she'd also let him meet the guy. All of this happened behind my back. I had no clue this was even a thing. It was like the rug had been ripped out from under me. I couldn't believe it. I don't know what was worse. The fact that Linda told him without even talking to me about it, or that Mason had been meeting this guy and keeping it a secret from me. I felt completely betrayed. I mean, I get it. He has a right to know who his biological father is, but the way they went about it, it felt like a knife in the back. I confronted Linda about it, obviously. I wasn't going to sit there and pretend like everything was fine. I asked her why she didn't tell me, why she went behind my back like that. Her response? She thought it would be easier if Mason found out from her. I was furious. Easier for who? I remember asking her, because it sure as hell wasn't easier for me. From that moment, things between Linda and me were never the same. The trust was gone. I tried to hold it together for Mason's sake, but how do you look at your wife the same way after she pulls something like that? The woman I'd been with for years had just blindsided me. And Mason? He started seeing more and more of his bio dad. The more time he spent with him, the less he wanted to do with me. It was like I didn't even exist anymore. He would come home late from school, or not come home at all sometimes. He'd barely talk to me, and when he did, it was short, like he didn't have time for me. I even suggested therapy for the three of us, thinking maybe we could work through this mess, but Mason shot it down immediately. "I don't need therapy," he said. "I'm fine." He wasn't fine though, and neither was I. Every day felt like another reminder that the family I thought I had was slipping away from me, piece by piece. I started noticing more signs that Mason was pulling away. He'd talk about his bio dad here and there, small comments like, "Oh, Dad says this," or "Dad took me to do that." It stung every time. He never called me Dad anymore, just Mike. Like I was some guy who happened to live in the same house. It was like he'd already decided that I wasn't his father anymore. And I guess in a way, I wasn't. Not in his eyes. I was really trying to hold on to the relationship, but it felt like I was the only one putting in any effort. Every time I reached out, it felt like he was pushing me further away. And honestly, I was starting to lose hope. It's hard to keep trying when you're the only one fighting for it. That's when I started realizing that maybe, just maybe, The damage was already done. I didn't want to admit it, but deep down, I knew this wasn't something we could easily fix. I had given everything to this kid, my time, my energy, my love, and it felt like he was throwing it all away. I didn't know how much more I could take, but I wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. After I found out that Linda had gone behind my back and told Mason about his biological father without saying a word to me, things between us started falling apart quickly. I couldn't look at her the same way after that. The trust was just gone. Every conversation felt like we were walking on thin ice, and honestly, I didn't know how to fix it. I was angry, hurt, and confused about why she thought keeping something like that from me was the right call. I tried talking to her, asking why she didn't tell me about the bio dad sooner, why she kept meeting him behind my back, but every answer she gave just made it worse. She kept saying things like, "I thought it was the right time," or "I didn't want to upset you." But all I could think was, how could you do this and think it wouldn't blow up in our faces? There's no coming back from that kind of betrayal. It didn't take long for us to start fighting all the time. It wasn't even about Mason anymore. It was everything. Little things that wouldn't have bothered me before now felt like huge deals. And we both knew this wasn't going to work. I didn't want to live in a house full of lies, and she didn't seem interested in trying to rebuild the trust that was shattered. We tried to stick it out for a few more months, but deep down, I knew the marriage was over. Eventually, I filed for divorce. It was one of the hardest decisions I've ever made, but at that point, it felt like the only choice. We were living like strangers, and every day just made things worse. The paperwork was messy, and the whole process dragged on longer than I thought it would. We argued about everything. Who got what? Who was responsible for what bills? But the biggest fight was over Mason. I didn't want him to feel like he had to choose between us. But it became clear that Linda wasn't fighting to keep him. She seemed more focused on her relationship with Mason's bio dad than trying to work things out between the three of us. I remember the day we sat down to talk about custody, and Linda just shrugged and said, "He should stay with you. He's already used to living here." At the time, I was relieved. I thought, okay, maybe this is my chance to repair what's left of my relationship with Mason. Linda moved out a few weeks later, and Mason stayed with me in the house. At first, it was awkward. He didn't talk about the divorce much, and I didn't push him. I figured he was going through enough already with everything changing so fast. I tried to keep things as normal as possible, hoping that if I gave him space, we could rebuild the connection we had before everything went sideways. So, fast forward a couple years from when things first started getting weird between me and Mason. By now, I've just gotten used to him being distant, and I tried to make peace with it, you know? Like, maybe this was just the way things were going to be from now on. I didn't like it, but I thought, all right, I'll let him have his space. Maybe he'd come around, right? Well, I was wrong. Anyway, Mason was getting ready to graduate from high school. Big moment, right? I was proud of him, even though we hadn't been close lately. He'd worked hard, and I was excited to celebrate this milestone with him. My family, my parents, siblings, cousins, everyone was excited too. We decided to throw him a big graduation party. Nothing fancy, but just a nice get-together with close family and friends to celebrate him. I reached out to him and told him about the party we were planning. He seemed kind of uninterested when I mentioned it, but he didn't say no, so I assumed he'd show up. I mean, why wouldn't he? It was his graduation party, and everyone was looking forward to celebrating him. I made sure to invite his mom, Linda, and even her family because I didn't want there to be any awkwardness. We could be civil for Mason's sake. The day of the party rolls around. We've got everything set up. Decorations, food, music, the whole 9 yards. Everyone's there, and we're all waiting for Mason to show up. I figured maybe he was just running late or something. But an hour passed, then 2, and still no sign of him. I started to get this sinking feeling in my gut, but I tried to shake it off. Maybe something came up, and he'd be here soon. As I'm trying to keep a brave face for my family, I see my niece scrolling through her phone, and she's giving me this weird look. I go over and ask her what's up, and that's when she shows me her phone. There, on Instagram, are pictures of Mason at another party. A different party. A party thrown by his mom and her family. And guess who's in all the pictures? Mason, his mom, and his biological dad. They were all there, celebrating together while my family sat around waiting for him to show up. I honestly didn't know what to say. I felt completely blindsided. My heart sank. I was angry, embarrassed, hurt, all of it at once. I just stood there for a minute, staring at those photos, while my niece awkwardly looked away, probably feeling bad for even showing me. Everyone at my party was sitting around, still waiting for Mason to show up, while he was over there with his other family, having a great time. I didn't want to ruin the mood for everyone else, but at that point, I couldn't keep it together. I I went inside, told my family that Mason wasn't coming, and just tried to hold back how upset I was. My family saw through it, of course. They could tell something was wrong, and I ended up showing them the pictures. Everyone was in shock, but they tried to comfort me. It's not your fault. He's young. He doesn't realize what he's doing, stuff like that. But honestly, none of it helped. All I could think was, how could he do this to me, after everything? The party went on without him, but it wasn't the same. My family did their best to cheer me up, but the whole time, I was just feeling this huge sense of betrayal. This wasn't just some random get-together, it was his graduation party. The least he could have done was tell me he wasn't coming, right? Instead, he left me and my entire family hanging while he celebrated with his bio dad and Linda. It was like we didn't matter to him anymore. Later that night, when everyone had left, and I was cleaning up the mess, it hit me hard. This was the kid I'd raised for almost his whole life. I was there for him when his bio dad wasn't. I did everything I could for him. And yet he didn't even have the decency to tell me he had other plans. It felt like I'd been replaced, like everything I'd done for him meant nothing now that his bio dad was back in the picture. I didn't sleep much that night. I just kept going over everything in my head, trying to figure out where it all went wrong. Was this my fault? Was I too hard on him? Should I have fought harder to keep him close when he started pulling away? I didn't know what to think anymore. The next day I was still stewing over it, trying to decide if I should talk to him or just let it go. But honestly, I was too hurt to let it slide. I decided I needed to confront him. If I didn't, this was just going to eat me alive. So that morning, when Mason finally got home, I called him into the kitchen. He walked in looking completely normal, like nothing was wrong. That just made me even angrier. I asked him straight up, "Why didn't you come to your graduation party yesterday?" He shrugged, like it was no big deal, and said, "I had other plans." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Other plans? Your whole family was here waiting for you, and you just didn't show up. You couldn't even call or text? He just shrugged again and mumbled something like, "I didn't think it was that big of a deal." That's when I lost it. I told him exactly how I felt, how hurt I was, how disappointed I was, and how much it stung to see him choose his bio dad and his mom's family over us. I told him that I had always been there for him, and I couldn't understand why he'd treat me like this. I wasn't yelling or anything, but I was definitely angry and I wasn't holding back. Mason didn't say much. He just stood there, looking like he didn't really care. He apologized, but it felt forced, like he was only saying it to get me off his back. He didn't look sorry. He just looked like he wanted the conversation to be over. After that, I didn't know what else to say. I was heartbroken, honestly. The kid I'd raised, the kid I'd loved like my own, was standing in front of me, acting like I didn't matter. I told him I needed some space to think, and walked away. That was the moment I knew something had seriously changed between us, and I wasn't sure it could ever go back to the way it was. So after the whole graduation party mess, things were even worse between Mason and me. It's like the last bit of our relationship that was hanging by a thread had just snapped. He barely spoke to me unless he absolutely had to. And I wasn't exactly going out of my way to talk to him either. We were just existing in the same house, walking on eggshells, avoiding each other as much as possible. And every time I thought about how he ditched his graduation party for his bio dads, it pissed me off all over again. I tried to play it cool for a while, thinking maybe he'd come around. Maybe he'd apologize for real this time, or at least try to explain what the hell was going on with him. But nope, nothing. He just went on with his life like everything was fine, while I was still sitting there stewing over it. I couldn't just let it slide anymore. I was getting more and more frustrated by the day. This wasn't just a little argument. It felt like a full-on betrayal, and I couldn't keep pretending like it didn't hurt. One morning I woke up and decided I'd had enough. I couldn't keep going like this, walking around with this giant knot in my stomach, waiting for him to give a damn. I needed answers, and if he wasn't going to offer them, I'd have to drag them out of him. So I waited until he got home from school. As soon as he walked through the door, I told him we needed to talk. He looked at me like he was annoyed, like I was just bothering him. "Can it wait? I've got stuff to do," he said, barely looking up from his phone. "No," I said, trying to stay calm even though I was already boiling. "We're talking now." He let out this dramatic sigh and followed me into the kitchen, dragging his feet like he was some kind of victim in all this. I sat down at the table and motioned for him to sit too. He slumped into the chair across from me, staring at his phone the whole time. I took a deep breath. "Mason, we need to talk about what's been going on. You haven't been yourself for a long time now, and I need to know why. You're shutting me out, and I deserve to know what's going on." He shrugged, still not looking at me. "I don't know what you want me to say." That response? It just set me off. "What do you mean you don't know what I want you to say? How about explaining why you ditched your graduation party without telling anyone?" How about why you're acting like I'm nothing to you? Finally, he looked up from his phone, but the look on his face wasn't regret or guilt. It was frustration. Like I was the problem here. Look, I didn't think it was a big deal. Mom wanted to throw me a party, and I went to that one. You're making this into something it's not. Not a big deal? Mason, your whole family was sitting here waiting for you, and you couldn't even send a text to let us know you weren't coming. And you didn't think that would hurt? You didn't think I would be hurt? He rolled his eyes. I don't know, okay? I didn't think about it like that. Mom and Dad wanted me there, so I went. I didn't think it was a big deal. There it was again. Dad. Every time he called that guy his dad, it felt like a slap in the face. I tried to keep my cool, but I couldn't anymore. Mason, I've been the one raising you. I've been here for you since you were 2 years old. That guy just showed up a few years ago and suddenly he's your dad? What am I then? Just some guy who pays for your stuff? He looked at me and for the first time, I saw a flicker of something. Maybe guilt? But it disappeared as fast as it came. I never said you weren't my dad. You're making this way bigger than it needs to be. I don't think I am, I said, my voice getting louder despite my attempts to stay calm. You've been treating me like a stranger ever since you started spending time with him. You stopped talking to me, stopped caring about this family, and now it's like you're only here because you have nowhere else to go. Do you even care about us anymore? He didn't answer right away. He just sat there staring at the table. After what felt like forever, he finally said, I didn't ask for any of this, okay? I didn't ask for 2 dads. I didn't ask for all this drama. I'm just trying to figure things out. That hit me hard. I hadn't thought about it from his perspective, to be honest. I mean, how could I? I was so caught up in my own feelings of betrayal that I didn't stop to think about what this was doing to him. But at the same time, it didn't excuse the way he'd been acting. I get that, Mason, but that doesn't mean you get to treat people like crap, especially not the people who've been there for you your whole life. You can't just push everyone away because you're confused. He didn't respond. He just kept staring at the table, his jaw clenched like he was trying to hold something back. I waited for him to say something, anything, but he didn't. Finally, I stood up. You know what? I'm done trying to fix this on my own. If you want to keep shutting me out, that's on you. But I'm not going to sit here and pretend like everything's fine when it's not. I walked out of the kitchen, leaving him there. I didn't want to argue anymore, and honestly, I didn't even know if I had the energy to. I just felt drained. This kid who I'd loved and raised like my own didn't want me in his life anymore, and I had to accept that. Over the next few days, things were tense. We barely talked, and when we did, it was just awkward small talk. I kept waiting for him to come to me and try to make things right, but he never did. Maybe he didn't know how, or maybe he didn't care. I don't know. But it became clear that whatever bond we used to have was gone. One night, I was sitting on the couch just thinking about everything that had happened over the last few months. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that this wasn't just a phase or a rough patch. This was a choice. Mason had chosen his bio dad over me, and no matter what I did or said, I couldn't change that. I knew things couldn't keep going the way they were, but I didn't know what the next step was. All I knew was that I couldn't keep living in this house with someone who didn't want to be here, someone who didn't see me as his father anymore. I had to do something about it. But what? That was the part I still didn't have an answer to. After that talk with Mason, things didn't really improve, and I knew something had to change. The tension in the house was just unbearable. Every time we passed each other, it was like walking through thick fog. Awkward silence, no eye contact, just this heavy feeling hanging in the air. I couldn't live like that anymore, and honestly, it didn't seem like he could either. We were like 2 strangers living under the same roof, but with too much history to ignore. It had been a few weeks since our last real conversation, and nothing had gotten better. If anything, it had gotten worse. Mason stayed out later, sometimes not even coming home at all until the next morning, and when I'd ask where he'd been, I'd just get a mumbled, "at a friend's," or "I was with Dad." Every time he said Dad, it was like another punch to the gut. He used to call me that. Now I was just Mike, the guy he lived with. His bio dad had taken my place in every way that mattered, and I was just there. I didn't want to make any rash decisions, but it was getting to the point where I didn't feel like I had a choice. Mason didn't want to be here. That much was obvious. He was just staying because it was convenient, closer to school, his friends, whatever. I was basically a roommate at this point, not his father. The more I thought about it, the more I realized I couldn't keep pretending like this situation was going to magically fix itself. He had made his choice, and maybe it was time for me to make mine. One day, after another night of Mason staying out, I decided I had to do something. He came home early that morning, looking half asleep and barely acknowledging me as he shuffled into the kitchen. I followed him in, and before he could disappear into his room again, I stopped him. "Mason, we need to talk." He sighed, clearly annoyed. "What now?" I took a deep breath, trying to keep calm. "Look, I can't keep doing this. You're barely here, and when you are, it's like I don't even exist to you. This isn't working for either of us." He looked up at me, tired but also defensive. "So what? You're kicking me out or something?" I hadn't planned on saying it outright like that, but as soon as he said it, I realized that's exactly what I was thinking. "Yeah," I said slowly. "I think it's time for you to move out. You clearly don't want to be here, and I don't want to keep pretending like everything's okay when it's not." His face hardened. "So that's it? You're just done with me?" I shook my head. "I'm not done with you, Mason. I love you, but this situation isn't healthy for either of us. You've made it clear you don't see me as your father anymore, and I can't force you to stay here if you don't want to. You've got other options. Your mom, your bio dad. You don't need to be here if you don't want to be." He stared at me for a moment, then laughed, this bitter, sarcastic laugh. "Wow, you're really just giving up, huh?" I felt a sting at his words, but I didn't let it show. "I'm not giving up, Mason. I'm giving you space. It's what you want, right?" He didn't answer. He just stood there, staring at the floor like he didn't know what to say. I could tell he was angry, but there was also this flicker of sadness in his eyes. Maybe he hadn't expected me to actually say it, to actually tell him to leave. But I couldn't keep living like this, pretending like everything was okay when it wasn't. After a long silence, he finally spoke. "Fine. I'll pack my stuff." He turned and walked out of the kitchen without another word. I stood there for a while, feeling this mix of relief and guilt wash over me. I knew I had done the right thing, but it didn't make it any easier. This was my son, the kid I'd raised since he was 2, and I was telling him to leave. But what else could I do? He didn't want to be here, and I couldn't keep holding on to something that was already gone. Over the next few hours, Mason packed up his things. He didn't say much, and neither did I. It was awkward and tense, but there wasn't anything left to say. He packed his clothes, his books, his computer, and whatever else he could fit into a couple of bags. He didn't take everything, just what he needed. I didn't ask where he was going, but I figured he'd end up at his mom's, or maybe his bio dad's. I wasn't sure, and honestly, I didn't know if I wanted to know. When he was done packing, he came downstairs and stopped at the door. He didn't look at me, just stood there for a second before finally speaking. "So, this is it?" I nodded. "Yeah, I think it's best for both of us." He still didn't look at me, but I could tell he was holding back something. Anger, maybe, or sadness. I wasn't sure. "Okay," he said quietly, and with that he opened the door and walked out. And just like that, he was gone. I stood there for a long time after he left, just staring at the door. I kept waiting for some kind of relief to wash over me, like this weight had finally been lifted off my shoulders. But it didn't come. Instead, I felt this emptiness. The house was quiet. Too quiet. Mason wasn't a loud kid, but his presence had always been there, filling the space. Now, without him, the house felt cold and empty. It hit me all at once. This was real. He was gone, and I didn't know if he was ever coming back. The rest of the day was a blur. I kept thinking about all the moments we had when he was little, teaching him how to ride a bike, helping him with his homework, taking him to his first baseball game. I thought about all the times he called me Dad and looked at me like I was his hero. And now, here we were, him gone, me alone, and everything between us broken. That night, I sat down on the couch, feeling completely drained. I'd done what I had to do, but it didn't make it hurt any less. I kept wondering if I could have done something different, if maybe I had pushed him too hard, or if I hadn't done enough. But in the end, I knew the truth. Mason had made his choice. He chose his bio dad, and there was nothing I could do to change that. I had to accept it, no matter how much it hurt. Update. It had been a few weeks since Mason moved out. Things were quiet, but that feeling of emptiness still lingered in the house. I was trying to move on, but just as I was starting to accept things, Mason and Linda showed up at my house one day. I didn't even have to ask why they were here. The second I opened the door, I could see it on their faces. This wasn't going to be a friendly visit. Mason didn't waste any time. As soon as they were inside, he hit me with it. "I need the college fund." I should have seen it coming. Even after everything that had happened, Mason still expected me to come through with the money I'd saved for him. It wasn't even the ask that got me. It was the entitlement. Like he just assumed I'd hand it over without a second thought. I sighed, trying to keep my cool. Mason, you lost that money when you walked out of this house. You've made it clear I don't matter to you anymore. Why should I pay for your college? Linda, standing next to him, crossed her arms and jumped in. You promised, Mike. You said you'd take care of his future, and now you're just going to back out because you're mad? This is about his education, not your feelings. That lit a fire under me. No, Linda. This is about respect. Mason hasn't treated me like a father in a long time. He's made his choice, and I'm done pretending like that doesn't hurt. I saved that money because I thought we were a family. But after everything you two have done, he's not getting a dime. Mason scoffed, like he couldn't believe what he was hearing. So what? You're saying your love is conditional? I looked him dead in the eyes. Yeah, it is. Because love goes both ways, Mason. And for the past few years, you've shown me that I don't matter to you unless I'm paying for something. You've been lying to me, hiding things. And now you're here expecting me to just hand over money like none of that matters? You lost more than just a college fund. You lost my trust. The room fell silent for a second. Mason's face hardened. But I could see a flicker of something. Maybe guilt, maybe just anger. Either way, it didn't change what I said. Linda shook her head, clearly frustrated. This is ridiculous, Mike. You're punishing him for no reason. You can't just take away his future because you're hurt. I stood my ground. I'm not punishing him. I'm protecting myself. I've given everything to this family, and now I'm being treated like I don't even exist. If you want to support Mason, you can, but I'm done. That's when Mason snapped. He stormed toward the door, not saying a word, just muttering something under his breath. Linda shot me one last glare before following him out. The door slammed, and just like that, they were gone. I stood there for a long time, staring at the door, wondering if I'd made the right decision. But deep down, I knew I had. They weren't here because they wanted to fix things. They just wanted the money. A few days later, I heard through the grapevine that Linda and Mason's bio-dad were planning to get married. Apparently, they'd been seeing each other for a while, way before Linda and I split up. I wasn't surprised. Everything made sense now. The coldness, the distance, the lies. They'd been keeping their relationship a secret because Linda wasn't financially ready to leave me. So while I thought we had a chance to fix things, they were planning their future behind my back. And Mason? He knew the whole time. He'd been keeping that secret from me, pretending like nothing was going on while they built their new little family. It was like getting hit all over again. First, I lost my wife. Then I lost my son. And now I was finding out that everything I'd been fighting for was a lie. They'd been planning their escape from the start, and I was just the last to know. In the end, I realized something important. Mason didn't want me in his life. He didn't care about the years we spent together, the things I did for him, or the love I gave him. He had chosen his real dad a long time ago, and I was just the guy who was supposed to pay the bills. Well, not anymore.